I think it's very important. So after, we've gone through half of the semester, there's only a few sessions left until the end. And you ask yourself, so what is the judgment decision making? We came here to hear about grand theories of the mind, and all you give us is this bias and that bias. And I think this is a good question to ask, because after over a decade, I've been trying to study this thing. I also don't know what the forest is. What is the grand theory of things? And it's very, very confusing, because when we try to organize everything together, this is the kind of mess that we see. So there's a list of cognitive biases. Sometimes all kinds of people try to make a sense of this. So there's this group of biases and this group of biases, and maybe these groups of biases are related to this group of biases, but almost every one of these biases are studied by completely different researchers who don't talk to each other. So if you study people in the norm theory, don't talk to prospect theory. So we don't actually have a good mapping of all the cognitive biases together. So if you're confused, you should know that I'm also confused. Actually, some of the stuff that I'm doing with you, so this project that we've been running together at HKU for 4 years, I think it's the first time that a single lab, a single university, a single course has tried to do all of these together. Because usually, what does a researcher usually do? Say, I want to specialize in sunk cost fallacy. I want to focus on decoy effect. And then they research this for 20 years, not talking to everybody else. Through these replications and extensions, we've done like 100 of these together. So I've done all of those. Almost in every one of the examples that I give you, I also show you our replication. So we got our hands dirty in some of these together. And the nice thing is that after we have 100 of these, we have a goal. So after we finish doing replications and extension, the next goal in the next 3-4 years, hopefully, is to go into meta science and take a step up, and then look at all the replications together. So once you have 100 of these, you can put this in a portal. We'll take your Qualtrics, put this in a nice portal where people can log in and have a username. And then multiple experiments can be done by people who logged in. So for example, you would come in and you would do both omission bias and action effect and prospect theory together. And then we can see what is the link between these two. Is the way that you answer this associated with the way that you answer this? And you would have expected that as a science, we would have connected these two together, or 3 or 4 or 5, but we haven't. So nobody has ever looked at all these cognitive biases together, but hopefully we at HKU would be able to do this. So now that we have 100 of these, now we want to link them together. So we're building this kind of portal. Well, we'll put all of these together, including the work that you do, so that we'll be able to gain this mapping. So we call this mapping the irrational mind, trying to understand, is there an irrational mind? Can you say that a person is more likely to be biased in this way? Is it associated with that way? So then we can see if there's like factors within the irrational mind and whether we can map this. But till now, we don't really have a good mapping of the mind. This is actually done by designhacks.com. So even it's not an academic group, it's a group of practitioners who are trying to map up all the nudges on how to give advice as a consulting firm. So people come to them and say, we want to increase this kind of behavior, or we want to decrease this kind of behavior. What should we do? So then they go to this. They try to say, okay, so maybe we take one from here and one from here and one from here. This is actually not backed up by evidence, but this is one of the closest things that I was able to find. This is how big it is. So if you want this, actually, I'll upload this to the OSF, what each bias actually means. And all of these, we visit. Also, most of these we visit already, so we can tell you which ones of these work to what extent. But behind each one of these lines and each one of these paragraphs, there's a whole world of findings that are very, very complicated. And we need a way to sort this out. So if you ask me what is the grand theory behind judgment decision making, we don't have one. This is a place for you that you can come in and contribute, because of what you're doing, replications, extensions, because of what it is that you're experiencing in this course, hopefully within 2-3 years, we'll have an initial way of investigating this. But I don't have grand theories to offer you. I'll mention some theories here, some theories there, but I don't know what the connections are. So judgment decision making, even though it's been around for a while, Tversky and Kahneman started this in the 1970s. Unfortunately, we still don't know a lot. Plus, because of the replication crisis, the science reform, and all that, even with the stuff that we do have, it's difficult to know what actually works, to what extent. If you try this in the lab, does this extend to real life? So complicated issues. So I try to expose you to that. At the beginning, we started with very, very simplified scenario lab studies. But increasingly, you'll see that I'm bringing this closer and closer to the field. And in your last component, the one that will drop next week, is the one that you will need to reflect on how to use these as interventions. So you will take one of the findings, default effect, for example, and say, how can we use this in order to create a change in people's behaviors? This is another more recent attempt. It's from an engineering group, so it's not even in psychology field, where they were trying to group those into interest biases, stability biases, action-oriented biases, pattern recognition biases. I don't know. Yeah, you can group those. I think actually if we sit together and we try to do this in this course, I feel like we'll get better categorizations than these. But some people have tried. This is another attempt from a different group. Some try and really categorize this, but it's very, very difficult to categorize this whole thing. Let me categorize for you what we've done in this course so far. So sometimes you may be a bit confused. Okay, we've had a lot of sessions, but what have we covered? This is how I try and group these together. So last time we talked about cognitive blind spots, and I'll add a few more of these today. We talked a lot about reference points. So norm theory and normality for me is the overarching framework that organizes everything. And I even showed you some examples of how I wrote a systematic review that tries to kind of say, okay, this is linked to that, but everything is related to norm theory and the concept of reference points and normality. So we've got a bunch of things that we did over there: exceptionality bias, action effect, status quo, default, first instinct bias, even the Monty Hall problem, and all that. And then there's stuff about the choice architecture and the context. So we talked about things like the decoy effect, less is better, less is more, money illusion, and so forth. All right, so I'll continue from the riddles of the last week. The point of the riddles is to show that sometimes we're not aware of the things that we're thinking. There's a certain pattern, there's a blind spot, something that we're not seeing, but it's not obvious to us that we're missing information. And that information sometimes causes us to get stuck and not be able to move on. So why is it that we can't notice all sorts of things? I think this is something that perhaps you've seen in Introduction to Psychology, or maybe read about or saw, but there's more and more videos coming out showing us change blindness, about our inability to see details, see changes that are just right in front of us. And some of those examples are very blunt. Sometimes you look at this and you'll see it's like, this makes absolutely no sense. How can the person not notice that the change is happening? But we'll try this also on ourselves. So I'll give you one example that will help a little bit to understand what I'm talking about.
Ever watched a movie or TV show and noticed how sometimes an actor's beer mug will go from full to empty to full again? Or an actress's hairstyle will change slightly in the same scene? Well, those are called continuity errors, and they result from cutting together many takes to create one continuous scene.
And one of the most common continuity errors involves food. Because the actors are actually eating, it can be nearly impossible to match what's on their plates from take to take. It's time for another test of your focus. We've set up a scene with our actors having dinner at a restaurant. All you have to do is track how many times their meals change. Remember, stay focused on their plates.
Cafe changes, take two.
Are you ready for this task? Let's do this together. Before I show you, of course, the answers, I want you to tell me what your answers are.
Remember, stay focused on their plates.
So how many changes to what's on their plates? Okay, keep track, count this.
Have 8 changes, take 2.
Are you ready to play? Let's begin.
It's been a really long time.
You still look the same.
I do.
You're even more beautiful.
I see you're still the same old charmer.
I feel like nothing's changed.
I got divorced.
Sometimes the thing you're looking for is right in front of your face and you just can't see it. Kiss me, baby.
So, how many changes to
the food?
Like 8 or something?
8 or something. Any other answers? How many? 9? 9 times the food changed? Yeah. Why were you laughing? Because it's not about the food. What is it about?
The actors, and there was also the drinks.
The drinks. The what? The dress. Hairstyle. So you noticed all this while trying to count the food. Very good. Yeah. So you know what this is about. Anything else changed? What else changed?
Did the face change as well?
Oh, vase. Anything else? Practically everything, right? Okay, let's see how they did this. And like, see for yourself whether you noticed this change before or not.
did you spot on their plates? Let's rewind and take another look. She begins with a salad, which becomes a massive lobster, and then magically some chocolate cake. His pork chop becomes chicken with vegetables. But suddenly, his plate is empty. Chances are you caught those changes, but did you?
How did you do 9? There were 6.
Oh, we were like also considering like the other stuff.
Oh, considering the other stuff. Okay, so 6 plus 3 other stuff.
I think so.
Okay.
Happen to notice the 10 other things that changed right in front
10
of your
other
face?
things.
You may have caught a few, but we bet you missed a lot of them. While you were paying attention to their plates, deception specialist Apollo Robbins was changing the props and the actors' wardrobes. First, she got a flower, then a new hairstyle. She also lost her necklace and changed her shirt. He changed his glasses and tie, along with his sweater. And the flowers next to him got a serious trim. Oh, and did you notice he also grew hair?
Kiss me, baby.
Yeah. So you've heard of this before? What kind of experiments did you hear that are related to this? There's one very famous one. No, tell me, what is it about? Yeah. So what's a good example for this? What kind of famous experiment? What did they do? A chimpanzee? Yeah. Yeah. Very good. The invisible gorilla, right? So what did they do? Yeah. Do you want to do that? Let's do that. Yeah, because not everybody's familiar with this, but I feel like it's important to do this. So let's do the invisible gorilla.
The monkey business illusion.
So he's very famous, Daniel Simmons. He's also a big part of the science reform movement. So I really appreciate this. And he became the editor that started this whole register report movement and all that. And he became very famous because of the monkey business, the gorilla, invisible gorilla. But this is an advanced version. So follow the advanced version.
Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball.
So notice the gorilla. We talked about the gorilla, so now it's easy for us to notice. What makes this the advanced version? The background changed. Good. Anything else change? So when we focus on the gorilla, because we're expecting a gorilla, we miss some other things. Yes, you wanted to say something? Yeah. Good. So once we focus on one specific thing, because we already expect a gorilla in there, so we notice the gorilla, although if you don't tell people that there's going to be a gorilla, they don't see it. About half don't see it. So
The correct answer is 16 passes. Did you spot the gorilla? For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half missed the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it, but did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game?
Good.
Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold.
Yeah, some interesting stuff. Do you want to know how stream this goes? Let's do another one.
Play along with the participants in this one.
What's up, buddy? All right, real good. I got a form. Let me just grab you a pen.
All right, here we go. All right, now basically all this is a release form.
Okay, stop.
What happened? A whole person changed. Which person changed? The person on the counter. How many of you did not notice this? Didn't notice this, right? Can you imagine just standing in front of the person and the person changes and you can't even see this? Have a look.
Have you noticed anything weird so far? If you didn't, let's run through this one again for you.
I got a form. Let me just grab you a pen.
All right, here we go.
If you caught this one, you may be surprised to find out you're in the minority. Now, let's run this one on a few more people to see just how many of them catch the switch.
Hey, what's up, buddy? How you doing? I just need you to fill out this release form, please. Let me grab you a pen.
Okay, here we go. Go ahead and just sign and date it. So where are you from?
New Jersey. How you doing today?
Great, how are you?
Real good, real good. I just need you to fill out this release form. Let me grab you a pen, okay?
Okay, here we go.
Let me just grab you a pen for this.
Okay. Making me sign a waiver for this, huh?
All right, here we go. Yeah, absolutely.
None of the next 3 people catch the switch.
Hello.
You may still be doubting that you would fall for this one if you were there in person.
What's your name?
Eva. Eva?
How could you possibly miss a person swapping out mid-conversation in plain view?
Can you describe the person who was here behind the counter?
He had dark hair. I think he had a black shirt on, but I'm not sure.
Can you stand up?
So that's Daniel Simmons. So sometimes it's really fun to be a researcher in psychology. You get to do some really cool stuff, plus be National Geographic. So if you want to go visit him in Chicago and work with him, some really cool stuff. And he does open science, so highly recommended. How far can we go with this? There's the last one I'm going to show you. It's called the door swap. You know this one? Door swap.
We've set up hidden cameras on the boardwalk to try and pull a fast one on unsuspecting grown-up brains.
Do you know where the subway is?
We've invited 2 actors to join us and ask people here for directions.
Excuse me, sir. Do you know where the metro stop is?
But when we switch out the person asking for directions,
And then where do you go?
how do you think these grown-up beach brains will react?
Great, thank you.
One asks beachgoers for directions.
Sir, do you know where the metro stop is? What is it? The metro stop. I've been looking for it and I can't find it. I'm not from around here. I keep looking for it everywhere I go.
After one of our actors asks for directions, surf's up. We switch out the actor. Do you think our beachgoers will even notice?
You see that guy in the red truck?
Yeah,
You see
I
them
do.
guys?
Yeah.
They'll direct you right away to the train station.
Oh, they will.
Construction site over there.
Right.
It's aquarium.
Okay.
To the left.
To the left.
If it seems like these beachgoers don't see the change,
Let's get on here. It's going down that way.
it's because they don't. But if you think this game works because Bearded Guy 1 looks a bit like Bearded Guy 2, let's try the switch with a not at all bearded woman.
Can I ask you a question? Do you know where the...
Better make it simple.
I'm trying to find the
That's
metro.
The what?
The metro.
That's a newspaper.
Is it? In England?
It's a daily newspaper, yeah.
Did you notice that they...
So really amazing cognitive illusion, sort of blind spot of us not being able to pay attention to even what kind of person, the gender of the person that we're talking to. Somebody completely changes. We're so preoccupied with ourselves and our explanations or focusing on one thing that we don't see the others. We're gonna come back to this with Daniel Kahneman a little bit later in one of the many things that got him the Nobel Prize, called the focusing illusion. I think one of the groups is actually doing a replication of something related to that. But it's something that's helpful to keep in mind about, whenever we are engaging in all sorts of decisions, is what is it that we're missing? What is it that we're not looking at? And I'm going to give you some examples about all sorts of things in the next few experiments about stuff that we don't see or don't notice or are not taking into account. So let me open up the Mentimeter. And here I'm asking you to compare yourself to the average HKU student, same gender, age, demographics as you. What do you think the chances are that these events will happen to you? Okay, so I will like my post-graduation job throughout my lifetime, will have a heart attack, have a mentally gifted child if you want kids. If not, you can skip this. Being fired from a job, own your own home, get injured in a car accident, live past 80, have an alcohol or drug abuse problem. As you're answering these, try and think, what is it that's going on over here? What is the experimental setup? What are your predictions and your hypotheses before I show you the results? All right, so if you've answered this already, what's this about? What are we trying to test? Sorry?
This is trying to say that this should average out, like each column should average out to 0, but it's probably not.
Which is going to average what? What's averaging?
Like the values of each of these should be 0, because if you take like this room and just average.
Oh, that's what you mean by average. Okay. Yeah. So there shouldn't be any differences between the person and the general population, the general HKU population. On average. Okay.
I think this is the better than average effect, where people think they are better than the average.
They think they're better.
Yeah, it's actually a real thing. Like
at being fired from a job.
So like people are going to say they're less likely to be fired from a job, like less than average. That's why I imagine higher than average intelligence, but then over half of the room raise their hand, like about like 70% or something. Yeah, right. And then it's like, whoa, then some like 20% was like
good. So terrific. So let's talk about it. So what's the difference between this one and that one?
Some of these are negative actually.
Some of these are negative, yeah. So you need to reverse them. Good. So when you have a mixture of positive and negative, what do you expect?
The positive skew, so right, the negative one skew to the left. Probably.
So people rank themselves as less likely for the negative things, but more likely for the positive things. Any difference between the positive and the negative in terms of the magnitude? Is it the same about the positive and the negative? Exactly the same?
It might depend on exactly how bad it would be.
Which one? Okay. Can you give me an example?
So probably getting injured in a car accident might skew a lot more towards lower than average, because it's like really bad. And also the heart attack one.
Mm-hmm.
So it might skew.
Okay. What's the difference between these two factors, for example? Car accident and heart attack. What's the difference? Okay. Controllability? Okay, good. Yeah, very good. What's the difference between this and the better than average effect?
Well, not everyone wants to have a higher than average heart attack, I guess. But then, like, for some of these questions, I think we can more accurately judge it. Like intelligence, I don't think everyone has done an intelligence test. So like people were just like doing it based on like gut feeling. But then I feel like here, you can make more kind of inferences. So like the better than average effect should, in theory, people want to present themselves as better. So like the hypothesis that we had just now was that it should move towards the left for the negative ones, such as heart attack. But for me, like because what I think is that for the kind of the terms that are easier to make inferences from your life, like heart attack, or the car crash one, like I don't go out, so I'm less likely going to have a car accident. Those are better to judge. and will be less prone to the cognitive blind spots, in my opinion.
Okay, yes. So in the better than average, we're looking at all sorts of traits that we have. Are we more intelligent, or are we different than them in all sorts of things that might lead to positive outcomes? Here we're actually evaluating likelihood and making predictions. Now, what is the likelihood that something is going to happen to me compared to other people? Like you said, there's positive and there's negative. So it's also interesting to see the magnitude by which is going to this side or going to that side. And your prediction regarding the likelihood of negative to the left and likelihood of positive to the right. So if we look at this, we say I will like my post-graduation job 28, have a heart attack about 0, have a mentally gifted child if you want 8. So far this meets with your predictions. So the ones for the positive are much higher than the ones for the negative. Have an alcohol or drug abuse problem much lower than that. But then we can do this with a very small sample and this number of items, but we can look at which one are controllable and which one are not controllable, which ones are related to some stuff that I might think myself is better than others or not. So this is taking it a step further than the better than average effect, including probabilities of all sorts of things like, my genes, if it's a heart attack, plus my habits, do I stay indoors or not? But it's really interesting to see that it's not 0. So just like with the better than average effect, it's not like should average themselves. I should consider myself to be, just part of a big group, but people have all sorts of biases about that, and that relates to this very famous effect called unrealistic optimism about future life events. So in this study, from 1980, in study 1, 258 college students estimated how much their own chances of experiencing 42 events. So there's a whole list of these kinds of events, and some of our students from previous years did this wonderful slides. As you can see, their slides are much nicer than my slides. So every time there's something exciting going on with my slides, it's actually you did this. HKU students did this. 2 of these actually worked with me on a thesis. So Samsung and Caleb Taik, joined by 2 others. So it's a whole group. And so there's overestimation of a positive effect, and there's an underestimation of a negative effect. And then you have all these items, all the positive events of all sorts of things. Some of them I didn't include this because they're not really related to you just yet. And then they actually even ran this in the classroom. And the result of the original study is just like we saw here in the classroom. So we ran a replication of this. What do you think the results of the replication were? Now, if I would ask you about this study, so now you have kind of like all these items and you have the general understanding of the unrealistic optimism effect, what kind of extension would you like to add to this kind of thing? What's interesting for you to ask?
Adding stuff that are mixed valence.
Sorry?
Adding some mixed valence items, perhaps.
What's a mixed valence?
So basically some things that might happen to you that you can't really say are good or bad enough. Normal life things like.
Oh, you're not sure how it's going to play out?
That's way gonna be perceived as positive. But,
okay.
But I think it depends on the demographic you have.
But something like some
But we can go along with this. There's some events that you can frame as positive or frame as negative. So we can try the same kind of event, one frame versus another frame. That's actually quite interesting. So you can include these 2 in different framing and see how that works. And if the same one goes in different directions just because of the framing, that's interesting. So how would you frame getting married in 2 different ways? So the positive one would be, okay. Yeah, interesting. So you're changing the reasons, right? You're changing the reasons. Yeah, but how about we want to keep this exactly the same event, but wanting to change the framing, just the way that we frame it. How do we do this? Sorry? What do you mean? Can you give me the 2 examples? What's the positive and what's the negative? how would you use exactly the same event by different framing of positive and negative? So if we remember, how did we do this with a very badly named Asian disease?
So you give the person a list of negative events, but you just put marriage in there, and for the other side, you just put marriage into the supposed event. By the surrounding question.
Okay, that's really good. So in comparison to the context, if you group it with a different group, that's actually really interesting. I don't know anything that's been done quite like that. Good. Yeah, that's one way of doing it. What's another way of doing this?
Conflict is like people will tend to think of it as far away from us as more pleasurable because we don't think it as very completely. But what if we say that, oh, like next year you're going to get engaged, or or tomorrow you're going to get married, you may need to plan a lot of stuff and like wearing food, like.
Yeah, very good. So here we use reference points in order to the group. How is this in relation to the group that it's in? Is the group positive, negative? So maybe you group it together, and then it's associated with that group. But the other way is in terms of the reference point and your expectations. So let's say, for example, you get married in 3 years, but you wanted to get married in 2 years, or you wanted to get married in 4 years. So is it sooner? Is it later? So that's considered to be different than your expectations. If it's later, maybe negative. If it's earlier, maybe positive. So it depends. You can think of all sorts of ways, but using the reference point in order to say something about the actual experience. So the experience is the same, still could be happy marriage, but is it before you expected it, after you expected it? How did it turn out? That kind of thing. So you can think about all sorts of things, and you can play with that in terms of the extension that you want to do. We actually ran two replications of this. One we did with Amazon Mechanical Turk online US participants, and the other one we ran on Prolific Academic with British folks. And we did a replication, group A, group B, and in both of them, the results were unbelievably similar. And both of them were successful replications with different kind of extensions. So you can see over here, the replication findings found that averaged over positive events, comparative judgments were significantly greater than 0. Average over negative events, the results were significantly smaller than 0. Found participants dominant unrealistic. In addition to that, we ran another replication of another study of unrealistic optimism as a thesis. And this is from Weinstein, 1984, Optimism, Bias, Replication, and Extension. In the current replication study, we found support for the original findings in the target article for comparative risk judgment. So what is the likelihood of risks happening with all sorts of categories in life? Not everything happens. So for example, in terms of tooth decay, high blood pressure, the effects were not very high, but with things like alcoholism, suicide, all sorts of dangers like mugging or even contracting the flu, it's a strong effect. Now controllability, there's actually another replications that we did. So we tackled unrealistic optimism. We also did better and lower than average effect. So we tackled this from many different perspectives. Here you can see vulnerability to crises. It matters who you compare yourself to. So self-outer judgment and perceived vulnerability to victimization. So what they were doing over here, so this was done by Elaine over here. The results supported the illusion of unique invulnerability when comparing to an average person with the medium to large effect sizes. So when you compare yourself to the average HKU student or the average person in Hong Kong or the average person in the US, then you see yourself as less vulnerable and very high optimism. But if you compare yourself to people that you think are very similar to you, like your parents or your friends, actually the effect kind of disappears. So you can see over here, there's the average person. It's a little bit small, so I don't know if you can see this, but there's the average person here. There's the closest friend, there's a parent, and one of your friends. And then we can see that the likelihood of the unrealistic optimism is when you compare yourself a heart attack, drinking problem, and cancer to the average person. But if you compare yourself to a parent, a close friend, or one of your friends, actually the effect kind of disappears. So it's a really interesting moderation. So in the 1980s, we thought unrealistic optimism is about all kinds of life domains. Then came up two different studies in 1984 and 1986, comparing about reference points, about is the reference point against another person, the average person? Is it against somebody that you know and love? So reference points of who you compare yourself against are really important in these kind of things. So you can take a classic finding, you can come up with a moderator, and then you can say, you know, perhaps this happens less or more under certain circumstances. The extension that they did over here, which perhaps you can think about how this relates to your own extension. So some of you were asking me, how do I know if an extension is a good extension? And generally, my answer to you is almost every extension that you'll come up with, I'm likely to say this is a good extension. People will come and say, but this is not how we learn psychology. Learn psychology that you need to look at the literature and identify the gap and then explain why the gap exists and how this is going to contribute to all sorts of things. Generally, I don't consider the literature to be reliable enough or that meaningful for me to refer to this too much. It's good to go and get some information and get some insights and try and build all this, but not completely necessary. First, doing a replication by itself, it's very meaningful. And if we can look at the follow-up literature and get some ideas on this and add it to that, that's terrific. And almost anything that you will add to these classic findings is going to be meaningful and interesting. The more that you add, the more valuable our insights are going to be. I have some preference for one kind of, extension over the other. So some of you were asking me, can we do about demographics? Can we do about age? Can we do about gender? There were other things, culture. These are interesting, but not that important for us to understand this effect better. But things about which reference point this refers to. Is there a moderating effect of positive, negative, or maybe a framing? Or, for example, this kind of extension, they were looking at, so here this is the likelihood of something happen, but controllability is one kind of DV, so we can ask them to compare the likelihood of this happening to you, the heart attack, the drinking problem, the cancer, in terms of the ability for you to control this, the ability for you to choose this kind of thing. So it seems like self-control and free will, ability to fight against these kind of things, also differs between the different targets. So a very easy, straightforward, meaningful. So adding two items about free will and perceived self-control, in addition to what was already in the replication, led to a very interesting replication and extension that I believe hopefully will soon publish this kind of thing. I wanted to show you this because there's all sorts of blind spots that we have regarding the way that we predict all sorts of things that are happening to us in our lives. We tend to think that the way that we perceive the world, the way that we perceive ourselves, the way that we make evaluations about the likelihood of things happening to us, that all information is available to us. If you ask an economist, economists assume it's built in all the equation, that all information is available, we're able to compute all the information and include this, and we make decisions, optimal decisions based on that. Obviously, we have a lot of blind spots. We're not able to even see what's in front of us. Given a lot of information, we focus on one kind of information, we miss everything else. We focus on ourselves, we miss everybody that's around us. So who we compare ourselves to, what kind of information we're looking at, and the information that we're not looking at, all of this is affecting our decisions on how to proceed. So this is kind of like a baseline for the two other related biases that are much more important for you in the way that you make decisions that are about to come. I'm going to introduce you to Tali over here. She's an expert on the optimism bias. She's in UCL. She's done some terrific stuff, and this is from her TED Talk about how to think about optimism bias and how this is affecting all of us in our everyday lives.
I'm going to talk to you about optimism, or more precisely, the optimism bias. It's a cognitive illusion that we've been studying in my lab for the past few years, and 80% of us have it. It's our tendency to overestimate our likelihood of experiencing good events in our lives and underestimate our likelihood of experiencing bad events. So we underestimate our likelihood of suffering from cancer, being in a car accident. We overestimate our longevity, our career prospects. In short, we're more optimistic than realistic, but we are oblivious to the fact. Take marriage, for example. In the Western world, divorce rates are about 40%. That means that out of 5 married couples, 2 will end up splitting their assets. But when you ask newlyweds about their own likelihood of divorce, they estimate it at 0%. And even divorce lawyers, who should really know better, hugely underestimate their own likelihood of divorce. So it turns out that optimists are not less likely to divorce, but they are more likely to remarry. In the words of Samuel Johnson, remarriage is a triumph of hope over experience. So if we're married, we're more likely to have kids, and we all think our kids will be especially talented. This, by the way, is my 2-year-old nephew, Guy, and I just want to make it absolutely clear that he's a really bad example of the optimism bias, because he is, in fact, uniquely talented. And I'm not alone. Out of 4 British people, 3 said that they were optimistic about the future of their own families. That's 75%. But only 30% said that they thought families in general are doing better than a few generations ago. And this is a really important point, because we're optimistic about ourselves, we're optimistic about our kids, we're optimistic about our families, but we're not so optimistic about the guy sitting next to us, and we're somewhat pessimistic about the fate of our fellow citizens and the fate of our country. But private optimism about our own personal future remains persistent. And it doesn't mean that we think things will just magically turn out okay, but rather that we have the unique ability to make it so. Now, I'm a scientist, I do experiments. So to show you what I mean, I'm going to do an experiment here with you, okay?
It goes on for a bit. So we're not going to go into this. I did not refer to the marriage example because I wanted to see this. But it's really interesting, the kind of inferences that people make about all sorts of things like marriage and the kind of biases that we have regarding all of those. And the question is, so let's say that we're unrealistically optimistic about marriage. Do we want to help people to be more realistic about marriage? It's a question that we should ask ourselves. Should we frame marriage in a different way in order to get people to be more realistic, going from 0 to closer to the 40% about their chances of being divorced? It's a question. I don't really know what the answer is, but some people are dealing with this, and if this is something that's interesting for you, this is something that you can do some research about. So general questions for you about books and places. How many books are in the Old Testament? Try and estimate this by using the range, low bound, and high bound. 95% certainty. So I want you to be 95% certain that you know the answer by giving me a low range and a high range. How many books in the Old Testament? Are you counting the Old Testament? Is that what you're doing? Only the Old Testament. How many books? As you're thinking about this, I'll give you another one. Should be easier because it doesn't involve knowledge of religious books. How many countries are there in Africa? Try and estimate by giving a range, low bound and high bound.
Imagining a rough map and where the divisions are, and then just oh.
How many did you get?
I don't know.
More than 2.
Oh yeah.
All right. So now that we have some responses, what am I going to show you? What is this about? Experiment. So we talked about over-optimistic, unrealistic optimism. What is this about? Well, we related to that. Now we're talking about how do we know whether we know something? How confident are we? So if we've overestimated our likelihood to experience all sorts of events in life, what are we going to see here? I don't know if about you, but in general, what am I trying to show you?
That we're definitely wrong.
Do we actually know what it is that we think that we know? And if we, I'm asking you for
The actual value isn't actually within the gap between the one and the high.
maybe not. We'll see. I don't know you. I don't know how well you're doing. But even without whether the lower bound and the higher bound, whether the real answer is in between, what do the lower bound and the higher bound reflect? How confident you are, okay?
I think context matters though, because here there's no penalty for anything. But there is this kind of thrill and the risk taking of guessing like really close range. And if you get it right somehow, you feel happy about it. But if you get it wrong, nothing to lose.
So
but
there is something to lose.
If it is on the test, I would definitely put 1 to 100. You know,
1 to 100.
Yeah, because I'm 95% plus certainty that's going to be within 1 to 100, right? Yeah.
Okay. Okay, interesting. So first of all, you can really get your answer correctly by going the whole range.
Yeah.
Right? If you want to be 100%, you choose the whole range. Why don't we choose the whole range?
Risk taking is fun.
The what?
Risk taking is fun.
And we think we know something, right? Okay, so good answer. I think the trick in everyday life is really to balance. You know, we want to be accurate, but we also, we don't want to, the fear of loss aversion, not wanting to be wrong. So between 10 and 31, as an aggregate, how many books do you think there are in the Old Testament? Higher or lower than 10?
Higher than 50.
Higher than 31?
Or at least it's.
So we had somebody who said that there's 100. The higher bound, I guess, so really went all the way. So I guess some of you kind of narrowed it down, and then a good question is, why did you narrow it down if you wanted to be sure that you're going to get it correctly? Some of you went all the way in order to ensure 100% I'm going to get the right answer. But it's nice to see this whole thing as an aggregate. So your prediction is that there's more than 31.
Yeah.
So the whole class together.
The whole class together as well.
Oh. Okay, how about this one? 29 and 55. How many countries are in Africa?
A bit higher than 55.
What? 50. I thought it's 52 or something.
54.
Did you just say
It's somewhere around the 50.
54.
Okay, let's see.
Don't believe your brain is overconfident? Deception specialist Apollo Robbins is hitting the streets with a game designed to prove you wrong.
I want to play a game with you real quick.
Apollo is going to ask people on the street some trivia questions, and you can play along at home. You don't have to know the exact answer to each of the questions, but just give a range that you're completely confident encompasses the answer. For instance, if I ask you how many continents there are, and you're not sure of the answer, but you think it's around 7, all you have to do is come up with a range of numbers that you're confident includes the right answer, like 4 to 12. Got it?
Okay.
Ready for the first one? I guarantee it's harder than you think. This is the Bible. How many books make up the Old Testament? Remember, all you have to do is pick a range. Are you feeling pretty confident in your answer? Because we're pretty confident you just got it wrong.
The number of books in the Old Testament. It's a range.
Oh, 10.
So we're going to say 10 books in the Old Testament. And the high number there could possibly be?
15.
15.
7.
7, okay. And how high would you go?
25.
What do you think? Do you have your range? The answer is 39.
It's actually 39 books in the Old Testament.
All you had to do was give a range that could, without a doubt, include that number. Not so easy, is it? Let's try another. How many countries are in Africa?
The number of countries in Africa?
17.
17. What's your high answer?
30.
30.
Yes.
Okay.
0.
And high?
I'll say 24.
Do you have your answer? Are you confident the correct answer fits within your range? The answer is 57. So how'd you do? Better this time?
Oh, sorry, you missed on that one.
Wait, so that's like a big one. Wait, really?
It depends on whether well self-surveillance is taking more custody.
Because
Yeah.
they have more.
It's higher than 31.
Yeah, currently it's 54.
They have more.
So we missed it together as a class. We missed it together.
If you're looking at the number of
Are you looking it up to see if National Geographic is correct?
Yeah, because like the time of recording.
African Union countries, Sudan just got kicked out because they just have to.
Oh, okay. We need to update the video then.
And also Western Sahara, like that exists. That's the thing. There's also some weird stuff around.
When you say kicked out, you mean what? For a country war? You said somebody got kicked out?
Like Sudan got suspended from the African Union.
Okay, African Union.
Like 3 days ago.
How do you just know these stuff like for fun? You just read the Wikipedia and remember everything. Like what?
I read the news. Like it's kind of big. I mean.
Okay, I don't.
Killed. What?
How to deal with this? One example that you give is just like increase the range, right? So he gave them these two, and he got this incorrectly, so he traded them.
What exactly does this game have to do with overconfidence? Think about it. You likely had no idea for certain how many countries were in Africa.
So why would you limit the range you gave? Even a little bit.
That's a good question. Why do people do this? I think it's really interesting that people do this out of their own accord, even when there's absolutely no motivation for you to limit it. Like they could have come up with any range, but they decided on a lower one. It even happened with us, even though we just talked about it, like cognitive blind spot and our inability to estimate this. So even for us as experts on biases, we fell into this trap, which is quite amazing. If you want to hear more about this, this is a good time for us to introduce Hidden Brain. Amazing podcast. I really adore this person, and he's such a good communicator. I mean, does such a good job at interviewing great minds in our field. So one of the people he's talking to about this one, I really recommend this, is Philip Tetlock. He wrote a book called Super Forecasters, and he actually works with DARPA in the US. He wanted to see which people are the best predictors of outcomes to us and what makes them different than other ones. If you're curious about this, strongly recommended. Overconfidence started with Baruch Fischer, who we did a lot of replications of his work. This one is from 1977. It's amazing that Baruch is still active and replied to us, and he was one of the most helpful people. He's the nicest guy. Gave us all the materials, helped us, worked together with us until we brought some of the other stuff to publication. So really, really interesting. We also did 2 replications of this work over here. And in both of them, we found strong empirical support for overconfidence hypothesis. So once again, in the US and in the UK, strong support for these kinds of things. So our replication of this whole domain about overestimation and overconfidence is really very, very strong. I want to show you a little bit of what Daniel Kahneman has to say about this. Daniel Kahneman believes that overconfidence is the #1 issue that we should aim to solve as judgment decision-making behavioral economists. But it's very, very difficult to address this. So let's hear a little bit from Daniel Kahneman.
Society rewards overconfidence. We want our leaders to be overconfident. I mean, if they told us the truth about the uncertainty, we would discard them in favor of other leaders who sort of give an impression that they know what they're doing. We want overconfidence. We support it. We sustain it. And there is an awful lot of it. I mean, most of what we read in the paper is overconfidence. Sometimes it's catastrophic. Just about every war that you see, I think that's a general rule, there are optimists among the generals, and there are optimists on both sides. And that is true for a lot of litigation as well. So a lot of conflict is fed by overconfidence. There is an interesting story here of 2 biases that work in opposite directions. So one familiar you can call it biased, but is what we call loss aversion. People put a lot more weight on negative events than on positive events, on losses than on gains. So that's one principle. If people are to gamble money on the toss of a coin, and they stand to lose $100, they will demand more than $200 to accept the gamble, which is in some ways ridiculously risk averse. So people are loss averse. On the other hand, they're optimistic. And so many of the decisions that people make, especially in starting new businesses, I mean, that is where it's been studied most extensively. People think they will succeed. They open a restaurant because they think they will succeed. But in fact, less than a third of small businesses survive for 5 years. So clearly, overconfidence is rife. And overconfidence and loss aversion seem to be acting in opposite directions.
Yeah, so this tension between, on the one side, overconfidence and unrealistic optimism, and on the other side, negative bias and loss aversion. And Daniel Kahneman has advised many governments and organizations about this, but this can really lead to some very, very negative outcomes. Who is this person? Spock. You know Spock? I know mainly the guy on the left, but obviously I watched there was one on the right. Ever watched Star Trek? Have you watched Star Trek before? Just the science fiction geeks. Yeah, so Spock, live long and prosper, the kind of gesture, where he's considered to be the rational, logical, never makes mistake. On the other side, there's the captain. So he's together with the captain who's very emotional and based on intuition and always acts on the moment. So they always go head to head. And always Spock tells him that what he's doing is irrational. Why am I bringing him up? Because recently I listened to an audiobook, an excellent audiobook, Scout Mindset by Julia Gilad, who does an amazing podcast, another one I recommend to you, Rationally Speaking. She also has this amazing talk on TEDx. I really recommend this. The whole book is an amazing way for you to train yourself how to overcome these biases. She doesn't only talk about the biases, but also she's not an academic, she works with organizations and people in order to help them with their overconfidence and the way that they make decisions. And I won't go into her TED Talk, but she did an analysis of Spock. She looked at all the Star Trek episodes. For every time that Commander Spock was talking to the captain and telling the captain, intercepting all 3 ships is an impossibility. An impossibility. The words sound so authoritative, so definitive, and yet less than 60 seconds later, Kirk has figured out how to maneuver in front of the enemy ship, stopping them from his own ship's hull before they can reach their destination. So she looked at all the interactions between Captain Kirk and Commander Spock. Every time Commander Spock was actually saying something about probability, she analyzed whether this led to an accurate prediction or not. So she looked at when Spock said this is an impossibility, and actually when he said that this is impossible, it is not impossible 80%, 83% of the time. When he said that this is very unlikely to happen, it actually did happen 50% of the time. So not an academic, but she looked at the media and the literature, and she did an amazing investigation on this, and she even plotted this. And in her book, there's a way for you to test yourselves. She gives a lot of questions, and she tries to help you to calibrate how well you're doing. So a perfect calibration is when you think that you 70% and you're actually 70%. You think you're 50%, you're actually 50%. So this is the perfect calibration. But if, like Spock, you're over on this side, that actually you're wrong most of the time when you think that you're going to be completely right, then there's time for you to really change the way that you're describing your probability. And you need a bit more humility, especially when you're next to somebody so incredible. So, very interesting stuff. I love it that she went to the media, and I know that she showed something in her book. She actually used real life examples from something that everybody knows. So we mispredict our emotions, we misremember our experiences, and there's all sorts of a variety of all sorts of things. There's other effects called hedonic adaptation. And sometimes we think that we're going to suffer a lot, but actually when it comes down to the actual experience, we don't suffer as much. So for example, in terms of marriage, some people think that in marriage, we're going to live happily ever after, but then after a while, you're going to get married and then you go back to your normal. There's the peak of actually getting married, but afterwards, it's kind of like adjust. And there's all sorts of interesting articles under that. The death of a spouse, so we think of our spouse dying as something being very traumatic and that we're never going to recover and we'll never get to be the same person again. But after a while, 1 year, 2 years, it doesn't even matter what the gender is, we get back to normal and sometimes we actually even get better. So even better than when we were married. So that's kind of interesting. What happens with a divorce? Some people think divorce is going to change me completely and I'll never recover from a divorce. People, maybe not to the full extent, but they do recover from a divorce and they do quite well, especially if the marriage was very bad. Being fired, oh my God, I'm going to get fired. My life is never going to be the same. Hedonic adaptation, we adapt to this. We even adapt to serious injuries. And we think, if I'm going to lose an arm, it's really going to affect me. Or I lose my legs, or I lose my eyesight. My whole life is going to change. I'll never recover. Actually, we ask about happiness. Happiness of people with injuries and disabilities is very similar between the general population and people that have serious injuries. So we tend to over-predict how much these events are going to affect us, but generally we adapt to everything. We just need to help people understand using evidence and using all sorts of interventions that things are generally going to be okay. The last thing that I want to talk to you about is relates to both Daniel Kahneman and Dan Ariely. I know I have the same name, and both of them are Israeli and are very influential in judgment decision making. And this is something actually that Daniel Kahneman comes from his own perspective about pain. Obviously, Dan Ariely went through some very serious stuff with pain. I think we'll start with Dan Ariely in the next session because it's very important for me to start with this with Daniel Kahneman about colonoscopy. So I'm going to finish with this. Think about how this relates to you, perhaps the pain of coming to this class or doing the replications and extensions, and how to best deal with this kind of situation.
Everybody talks about happiness these days. I had somebody count the number of books with happiness in the title published in the last 5 years, and they gave up after about 40, and there were many more. There is a huge wave of interest in happiness among researchers. There is a lot of happiness coaching. Everybody would like to make people happier. But in spite of all this flood of work, there are several cognitive traps that sort of make it almost impossible to think straight about happiness. And my talk today will be mostly about these cognitive traps. This applies to lay people thinking about their own happiness, and it applies to scholars thinking about happiness, because it turns out we're just as messed up as anybody else is. The first of these traps is a reluctance to admit complexity. It turns out that the word happiness is just not a useful word anymore because we apply it to too many different things. I think there is one particular meaning to which we might restrict it, but by and large, this is something that we'll have to give up, and we'll have to adopt a more complicated view of what well-being is. The second trap is a confusion between experience and memory. Basically, it's between being happy in your life and being happy about your life, or happy with your life. And those are two very different concepts, and they're both lumped in the notion of happiness. And the third is, it's the focusing illusion. And it's the unfortunate fact that we can't think about any circumstance that affects well-being without distorting its importance. I mean, this is a real cognitive trap. There's just no way of getting it right. Now, I'd like to start with an example of somebody who had a question and answer session after one of my lectures reported a story, and that was the story. He said he had been listening to a symphony, And it was absolutely glorious music. And at the very end of the recording, there was a dreadful screeching sound. And then he added, really quite emotionally, it ruined the whole experience. But it hadn't. What it had ruined was the memory of the experience. He had had the experience. He had had 20 minutes of glorious music. They counted for nothing because he was left with a memory, the memory was ruined, and the memory was all that he had gotten to keep. What this is telling us, really, is that we might be thinking of ourselves and of other people in terms of two selves. There is an experiencing self who lives in the present and knows the present. It's capable of reliving the past, but basically it has only the present. It's the experiencing self that the doctor approaches, you know, when the doctor asks, does it hurt now when I touch you here? And then there is a remembering self. And the remembering self is the one that keeps score and maintains the story of our life, and it's the one that the doctor approaches in asking the question, how have you been feeling lately? Or how was your trip to Albania? Or something like that. Those are two very different entities, the experiencing self and the remembering self, and getting confused between them is part of the mess about the notion of happiness. Now, the remembering self is a storyteller, and that really starts with a basic response of our memory. It starts immediately. We don't only tell stories when we set out to tell stories. Our memory tells us stories. That is, what we get to keep from our experiences is a story. And let me begin with one example.
Just one example.
This is an old study. Those are actual patients undergoing a painful procedure. I won't go into detail. It's no longer painful these days, but it was painful when this study was run in the 1990s. They're asked to report on their pain every 60 seconds. And here are two patients.
These two patients, which one suffered more? Suffered more pain? Patient A or patient B? B.
Patient A.
Sorry?
Patient
B. So many of you said patient A.
But they feel.
Fact-wise, patient
patient
A
B.
suffered more, but you said patient A because?
To remember.
That's the remembering. So rather than the experience itself, because the intensity over there is much higher.
Those are their recordings, and you are asked who of them suffered more. And it's a very easy question. I mean, clearly patient B suffered more. His colonoscopy was longer, and every minute of pain that patient A had, patient B had, and more. But now there is another question. How much did these patients think they suffered? And here is a surprise. And the surprise is that patient A had a much worse memory of the colonoscopy than patient B. The stories of the colonoscopies were different, and because a very critical part of the story is how it ends.
It's a remarkable thing about the way that we experience our lives, the way that we remember things, the way that we experience, painful events in our lives, like taking this course. So you can think about what it means for you and how you want to experience, whether one high intensity of, let's say, multiple quiz exam of everything that you listen to in the lectures, or something that has, intensity somewhat throughout the whole semester, and then decreasing this towards the end so that your remembering yourself will be like you enjoyed the course very much and didn't suffer as much as the average. So everything is part of a very long-term plan. It will pay off when you're remembering stuff. Even if right now you're experiencing stuff is not feeling very comfortable. Next week we'll start with the Dan Ariely story, which also has a few angles to this. But for now, we'll conclude. If you have any other questions about, I'm going to stay here for a while, but of course Slack is the best way to approach this. I'll see you next time.